Welcome. Thank you for joining us today at the UConn Humanities Institute. I'm Yohei Igarashi, Associate Professor of English and Associate Director here at the Institute. We have an exciting event for you today featuring Wendy Chun discussing her new book, Discriminating Data. I should say today's presentation is part of the Institute's Digital Humanities and Media Studies Initiative, and also part of our signature Future of Truth initiative. And really, there's no intellectual who better bestrides those two initiatives of ours than Wendy Chun. So let me introduce Wendy Chun. She is Simon Fraser University's Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media, and she leads the Digital Democracies Institute there. She's the author of several works, including Control and Freedom, Power and Paranoia in the Age of Fiber Optics from 2006, Programmed Visions, Software and Memory from 2011, Updating to Remain the Same, Habitual New Media, 2016, and most recently, Discriminating Data, of course, the occasion for today's event. Each of these groundbreaking books in this tetralogy is from the MIT Press, and I also noticed each one is published like clockwork, 5 years apart. So they've been coming out at a steady clip. Chun is also the co-author of Pattern Discrimination from University of Minnesota and Meson Press from 2019. Before joining Simon Fraser, she was professor and chair of the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown, where she worked for almost 2 decades and where she's currently visiting professor. She's also been a visiting scholar at the Annenberg School at Penn, a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and has held fellowships from the Guggenheim ACLS American Academy of Berlin and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. So for today, Wendy and I thought we could discuss her book somewhat informally for about 30 to 40 minutes or thereabouts. And then Wendy will take questions from all of you in the audience. So Wendy, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, and why don't we begin?
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
So I've had the pleasure of reading Discriminating Data, which is hot off the presses. I believe it only came out 2 weeks ago. And at the Humanities Institute here, we had this very engaged, extensive book discussion about it. But since not everyone in the audience will have had the chance already to have read through your book, could you tell us first how you came to write this book?
Yeah, so a lot of the background behind the book is in the preface, because it actually, although it is the last book I've written, I feel as though it's a book that I've been writing and thinking about probably since I started grad school in 1992. And so I have a very unusual background. I started out in systems design engineering, and then I got a PhD in English literature. And part of my goal was always to try to make sense of the resonances that I saw between the two disciplines. And to increasingly, I find, bring them together in order to take on problems that are really hard and that no one discipline can take on. And so since it's the preface that outlines it, why don't I just read the last part of the preface. So I begin by talking about the Montreal Massacre and why I moved towards English literature. And then I say, for the past 25 years, I've been focusing on understanding how the internet emerged as a mass medium to end mass media. I've used and developed new media theory to understand how a control technology was bought and sold as a technology of freedom, how software's emergence as a vapory thing encapsulated neoliberal dreams of programmability, how old media remain in our habits as we update to remain the same. Throughout, I've explored the centrality of race and sexuality to shaping technologies and to the bizarre and debilitating framing of technologies as solutions to profoundly political problems. I've also called for a close engagement with technologies and culture, not because I'm a technological or cultural determinist, but because I believe that engaging both intensely moves us away from either of these positions. The point is to see how they intersect and collide. That is, how drilling down into any technology reveals profound social and cultural assumptions and vice versa. Discrimination and injustice do not come from outside, they're in there, because technological defaults are embedded with cultural and social prejudices. At the same time, I've insisted that the traces of a different world are also in there. The limitations and vulnerabilities of technical control systems make it clear that freedom cannot be reduced to control. Freedom makes control necessary, but never enough. The vicissitudes of execution echo the lively world before us and undermine any dream of total solutions or programmability. New media, as I argued in Updating to Remain the Same, are wonderfully creepy, and our habits are shards of others contained within ourselves. Over the past years, I found myself turning back more and more to my engineering roots to discover these moments of possibility, as well as the ways in which eugenic and segregationist thinking have become integrated into our machines. The goal has been to bring engineering, computer science, humanities, social sciences, and arts together to take on the hard problems that we face. This book reveals the communities and neighbors that haunts concepts such as correlation, homophily, authenticity, and recognition that are so key to our current communications technologies. It seeks to remain with those whose traces make possible our own by confronting rather than running away from discrimination. Understanding that touch is neither banal nor always benign, it nonetheless starts from these relations in order to create different worlds in which we can live in difference, and in which freedom finally becomes meaningful because it is freedom for all.
Thank you. I wanted to return to some of the things you just read, like interdisciplinarity and living in difference. But I wanted to begin with this idea, actually what you wrote, how drilling down into any technology reveals its social and cultural assumptions. I thought that was a really interesting and unique aspect of your work. There's been a spate of books on which are critiques of computation and artificial intelligence by Ruha Benjamin, Kate Crawford, Meredith Broussard, and others. But your book really does seem interested in drilling down into computational processes to expose and to examine the core statistical or mathematical assumptions. And then in many of your chapters, you do this kind of virtuosic reconstruction of the historical, social, cultural background of those statistical methods and so on. For example, correlation in chapter 1, correlation, linear, and logistic regression. You show how this ties early 20th century eugenics with 21st century data analytics. So I was wondering, since your book makes us think so hard about these core concepts, which seem quite benign, you know, calculating correlation coefficients doesn't seem such an inherently bad thing. And you do say that it's not inherently eugenicist to do linear regression, but could you tell us more about this general approach where you drill down, as you say, and then kind of go from there? And what you would like readers to get from this method?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think that's what's always been important to me, is to move away from the suggestion that's often made in nowadays regarding technology, et cetera, that the problem is that technology ignores the humanities and social sciences. And that if we want ethical tech, somehow we can just add a little bit of humanities and social sciences, and then ta-da, we'll have ethical tech. And what for me is so important is to bring out the ways in which the social sciences and humanities and technology are already embedded within each other. So it's not that we need to add the social sciences and humanities to tech, but realize that it's already there. And the problem is that it's actually a bad version of it that's there. And so for me, what's key are like concepts such as homophily are taken from the social sciences. So the idea that similarity breeds connection, that and therefore echo chambers or segregation is a default, it comes from social sciences studies. But in terms of correlation and eugenics, et cetera, I think what's always been key for me is, and this I think comes from a long history in terms of my methodology, is to take things that sound alike, that might even be homonyms, but seem so profoundly different in two different areas, and then do historical and theoretical work to see where they coincide or collide. So again, the internet is a control technology, TCP/IP. Control is a very specific concept within engineering. And when people were talking about the internet as a freedom of technology of freedom, I was like, well, wait a minute, it's control technology. How is this possible? But also when people were talking about control, they were talking about a level of control that's actually not technologically possible. So part of my methodology is always to start with concepts which seem alike, but which are different in order to bring out assumptions or biases that are embedded within both of them. And for me, what was so key about correlation is that, we were told at the beginning of the 21st century, this is the century of big data. And this is the century of big data because of correlation. Correlation is radically different. Knowledge now means knowing the future, not the past, et cetera. But the same rhetoric about correlation as fundamentally changing knowledge, et cetera, was eerily similar to the rhetoric of eugenicists at the beginning of the 20th century. And correlation actually came from their work. And their work tried to understand what didn't change in the past and the present, and therefore they argued the future in order to shape certain futures. And so it was key for me to think through, okay, what does it mean that correlation is emerging again, right? This isn't correlation's first rodeo. And how is it different? Because clearly it is different as well. And what do these differences mean?
Right. I thought reading your book, the concept of neighbors or neighborhood was also one which had this multivalent aspect that you unfolded. I mean, neighbors both in the negative sense of homophily, of being lumped together with those who are deemed to be like you, but also you gesture toward neighbors as a potential place for moving beyond discriminatory data in some ways. But this actually leads me to another question, which is in understanding the humanistic and social scientific ideas that are already in there, that we're not just, it's not that we just need to add on the humanities or the social sciences. It does seem like, as you mentioned in your preface, it requires some kind of interdisciplinary competencies. And so, as you say, you draw on critical theory, very familiar to those in the humanities, especially literary study, statistics, machine learning tools, but then also psychoanalysis, network science, and so on and so forth. And so, I mean, what would you say to humanists who say, perhaps resist, or this isn't the favorite thing to do, to think about logistic regression or correlation? Do you have any practical advice so that more of us can see what's already baked into the technologies?
I think that grappling with the core concepts of statistics right now are so key. And they're so key because, of course, everyone will talk about how opaque these algorithms are, right? Especially machine learning. And they'll say, this is, we don't know what our machines are doing. And this is true. But so trained as an engineer, I can tell you theoretically what my machine is doing at any time, but I can't tell you what it's doing right now. So this opacity isn't new, although what's different is the difference between laying down commands or programs and seeing what actually runs and how it runs. But you can say humans are opaque too. I don't know what you're made of. I don't know how, various things about your metabolism, and yet we're having this conversation. And we're having these conversations because there are certain fundamental concepts such as language, et cetera, that are key to communication. And I think we have to have that in mind. There are certain fundamental concepts to machine learning that are key and that determine in many ways what's possible or not possible. And those are mainly statistical or distributional, or draw from probability. Clearly more complicated systems move towards, other forms of regression, but linear regression, logistical regression, all neural nets are logistical regression on top of logistical regression on top of logistical regression. These concepts are key and they're not that hard. And they're determining and being used in our lives in so many ways that I would say just basically thinking through, like, it's y equals mx plus b. It's trying to figure out a slope given various factors. And the reason why we need to think through these and engage them, or think through logistical regression, which is it yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and the sort of profound binary thinking that's part of logistical regression that anybody who's taken critical theory should be able to understand and also see the limitations of. It's really not that hard. And when we view somehow that it is, then we get into a box where we say, well, we can't do that. And the other thing we should realize is that a lot of these things are canned now. A lot of students in engineering, et cetera, or people especially who use this, just like type in this thing into a Jupyter notebook, run it, it does everything. So the certain opacity is there for everyone now. And I think that just having everyone, both within the various communities, just sit down and, do linear discriminants, or, do eigenvector analysis from scratch to see what that's all about. I think that's something that we can all do.
Yeah, I remember in my graduate seminar last semester, we had Goodreads data. And so we were doing things like correlation between the review, the rating, and say the number of pages in the book. It's actually fairly simple. I agree with you. This actually reminds me of another question, which is an interesting feature of your book. Those of you who have had the privilege of reading it already will know what I'm talking about. It's these hand-drawn illustrations by your collaborator, Alex Barnett. I don't know if that's visible. And in some ways, these explainers are very approachable and somehow defamiliarize the printed formulas and diagrams in textbooks or online. But in other respects, I think they also move fairly quickly and can be challenging. And so when you invoked critical theory earlier, I was thinking, I wonder if this is like the new theory where, it does take some work. It's a little bit demanding, demands rereading for sure, perhaps additional research. In any case, I was wondering, how did you decide to present these methods or concepts in this particular way with your collaborator?
Yeah, so Alex and I have been friends for a very long time. And when I was working on matrix factorization, we were talking about it together and, trying to figure it out. And he drew me this great, diagram, which became part of my talks. So I started using it. And then Alex was a math professor at Dartmouth before he moved to the Flatiron Institute. Mm-hmm. And he loves teaching. He loved teaching undergraduates at Dartmouth. And he really, so the chalkboard style was his idea and comes from the lectures that he gave to undergraduates in mathematics. And what he did was, he read the book, we talked about the examples, and he used the examples as the basis for the examples that he drew out. And so the idea was they would speak to each other, and it would give that kind of break to people. I think that's for some people, the diagrams and thinking through correlations is tough. For other people, it's the part on correlation via Lacan that's tough. I think that there's different things that's there, but hopefully for me, there are moments to reread and constantly reread and hopefully create new dialogues by drawing from something that's familiar to someone but not others, and then putting all of those together.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wanted to focus, now that we've talked about some general things about the book, about one of your interludes or interchapters on red pill toxicity. So at the Humanities Institute here, we have underway a project that's bringing epistemology and narrative to the problem of misinformation, disinformation, and other information disorders. And your chapter on, or the interchapter on red pill toxicity, talks about how, here's a quote from it, the more politicians lied and the more they dissembled or fueled disinformation, the more authentic they seemed. And then you say the twinning, the going in, hand in hand of misinformation and authenticity. All of this raises the question, it seems to me, about the potential role for something like literary scholars, those who study narratives, fiction, epistemology. So there does seem to be a way where literary scholars who have studied verisimilitude, how fiction versus nonfiction works, can bring something to bear on this problem. I mean, these are things we've studied for decades, if not a century. So I was wondering if you see some role for, in addition to humanists gaining some competency in statistics and in the computational disciplines, what is the role of narrative and epistemology to combat disinformation?
Yes, this is so key. And I think that one thing we need to move away from is the idea that humanists themselves always have to change and that they're lacking, so therefore they need to do X, Y, and Z. Because I think that interdisciplinary work happens because all of our approaches, we care about a problem, we can't solve it on our own, and we're profoundly aware of the limitations of our own disciplines. So we work with others because they're different. And one of the reasons why people from other disciplines work with humanists is because of the rich history and ability to analyze narrative and literature. And so why this is so key in something like misinformation is that it's been shown over and over again that fact-checking, although important, isn't enough.
Yes.
And in fact, fact-checking can spread the stories, et cetera, et cetera. And what's so key is that, as you alluded to, people, especially within literary studies, have known for decades that people can read fiction and find it absolutely true, whether or not it's correct or incorrect. And the question of correct or incorrect can actually take us away from that question of truth, which is so important. And so one thing that we're doing in the Institute that's related to this is saying, rather than saying, is this correct or incorrect, let's ask ourselves, why do people find something to be true, irregardless of its facticity? And to answer a question like that, you need literary studies, you need media studies, you need soap opera studies. You need all sorts, you need theater and performance studies to understand the ways in which we're characters, not simply marionettes. And I think having this as part of the dialogue is absolutely key, because it also moves us away from this really limited understanding of what is truth. When truth simply equals what's correct or incorrect, we lose, as Hannah Arendt and other people have argued, this larger question of what is true. And I think the example for me that encapsulates this is global climate change models. Because global climate change models, if we believe they're true, right, will act in such a way that we won't be able to verify their actual predictions, right? So what global climate change models make clear are the absolute difference between being correct, being validated, And what's insidious about a lot of machine learning programs and a lot of these programs is truth is reduced to what is repeatable. Right? You verify a program based on its ability to predict usually past values towards this other question of truth, which is so clearly compelling and important right now.
Mm-hmm. And you have this wonderful moment where you kind of dig into the etymological differences between truth and facticity, and then the broader implications of that. I think another thing that readers will, that will really strike readers is homophily, not a term that I admit I was familiar with beforehand. And I've read Merton and his Sociology of Knowledge work, but I still hadn't known about homophily. So you have this wonderful chapter on it where you show that the principle of homophily has become axiomatic, this idea that similarity breeds connection. And this amplifies segregation, polarization, hatred, online, and of course offline too. And I was thinking when reading this chapter that, well, people like to be among other people who are like them or they perceive to be like them. This seems to be a pretty deep principle or tendency in humans. So how do we get beyond that? And you pose, I think you give us some glimpses of possible ways beyond homophily. So I'll just name 4 that I flagged. One was ambivalence. Another was indifference, which I kind of like. Another was living in difference. And then another was, or actually maybe I only had 3. Anyway, a couple of these, like non-connection and indifference, reminded me of works like Jenny Odell's popular book, How to Do Nothing, where it's a very informed, deliberate kind of opting out of things like homophily. But then these others, like ambivalence or living indifference, seem to point to perhaps a new kind of cosmopolitanism, a different way of understanding relationality, sociality, and existing within these kind of conflict and difference, as you, I think, put it toward the end of your book. So could you expand on how you imagine we get beyond the homophily principle, which determines so much of our lives online?
So what's so key for me is that homophily is, as you noted, usually promoted as natural, birds of a feather flock together, and that people do this because because they're comfortable. Right? And what I found so interesting is if you think about the recent revelations from the Facebook whistleblower, the more people were put together with people who were like them, friends and family, et cetera, the more agitated they became. And so the idea somehow that when we're around people who are like us, we're more comfortable, seems fundamentally flawed. And for me, the example is the magnets, right? So you take a whole bunch of particles which are charged alike, they actually repel each other, but they remain the same by being attached to their opposite. So the hatred of the other is often what brings together this group. And homophily, is a very strange term because it makes the individual, it makes it seem as though it's simply an individual preference, right? So it becomes a synonym for racism, where you get rid of questions of institutional racism, et cetera, and you just say, well, people naturally prefer this, but the way you show that you love your own is by fleeing when other people show up. So part of it is to say, well, let's think through homophily, not because there aren't moments where similarity breeds connection, but the world around us is filled with these moments which are so clearly other. And even in the Merton text, which spawned the term homophily, they also coined the term heterophily. Right. And they said, Aristotle says, that not only, then they question, do birds of the feather always flock together? And one example, like if we think of electricity and magnetism, that's heterophily, going from negative to positive. In a world of 100% gender homophily, heterosexuality is a miracle. So there are constant examples all the time of heterophily, and heterophily is increasingly used by recommender systems in order to get people to choose different things, right? But I think for me, rather than thinking homophily or heterophily, what was so important was to think through the network, not simply in terms of this is a node, and here's a connection, but rather thinking of the network as all those gaps, without which what seems to be a connection wouldn't be possible. Because within these gaps lie all these other forms of connection. Right. So if you go to Granovetter's famous formulation of weak ties, he says there are also these things called absent ties, which are so weak they don't count as weak ties. And he says things like nodding strangers, or things that become so important during pandemics, right? That everything that gets ignored are actually these teeming spaces. And so part of thinking through indifference was trying to think through these teeming spaces that actually make possible connection. And it also comes from riding the bus, being on public transportation, going into public spaces. Think of everything you have to not care about in order to do this. And if you think about these infrastructures as actually enabling certain connections to appear, but are absolutely fundamental to the network as a whole, I mean, you see that the fundamental role that indifference plays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, all of this seems premised on a pretty, or imagines at least a fairly urban, high density setting. Would you say that's true?
No, because you can think through roads in rural areas. You can think through the ways in which the air around us, also the atmosphere, et cetera, plays a certain, it connects us all together. It seems this gap, but it's actually a profound way in which various minerals, et cetera, are transported. You can think through water, et cetera. I think that there's a way in which if we actually think through the ways in which we're connected, you have a very different understanding.
Yeah, that's true. I wanted to move on to another chapter. This one is fascinating also. This one was on authenticity. And I thought it's a wide-ranging chapter. It starts with Trump, goes into recommender systems. But I thought it articulated so well this icky kind of gross feeling that many of us have in navigating our digital lives, where we've been conditioned to act in certain seemingly authentic, consistent, predictable, transparent ways by social media platforms. And it reminds me actually of this very old Zadie Smith essay where she's complaining about how Facebook is just how a certain teenager imagines social life and how reductive and terrible it is. And so I was wondering, the end of that chapter also gestures to this idea that we might be able to take back control, to wrest back some sense, some of our own performances online. Could you tell us what that would look like? What exactly you have in mind?
Yeah, so this is also a reaction to, so part of this is to say, authenticity, as you mentioned, is this call for us to be transparent, but rather than being sincere, where your outer becomes like this, your outer and inner coincide because somehow you're being good. The idea is you're showing you're authentic by showing some weird transgression on the outside, which shows that, yes, you are being forthright, et cetera. And then these are used to cluster us in certain ways. And also to agitate us. And if I'm sure you've seen the docudrama Social Dilemma, right? And it launched a lot of really important debates, but there was this really bizarre notion that somehow we're marionettes, right? And that social media is manipulating us completely, and we're addicted, and it has a very behaviorist understanding of human beings. And this isn't to say that behaviorism doesn't explain certain phenomenon, but again, it doesn't explain everything. And we have to be extremely agitated and triggered for us to act in ways that are completely subsumed within behaviorist models. Mm-hmm. And so the question I had was, okay, if this explains a certain phenomenon and a certain mode of agitation, which fits in with clickbait, advertising, et cetera, there is this other entire realm of our interactions. And this question of authenticity is clearly important to theater and performance studies, where there isn't this idea that somehow the actor and the character coincide, but it's actually the dissonance between them that enables certain modes of truth and engagement. And so I was thinking, well, and this comes from the last book, maybe instead of viewing ourselves as marionettes, we're characters. And acknowledging ourselves as characters gets us to think through our difference between actors and characters. I mean, clearly, you know, if you look at anybody's Instagram feed, et cetera, there's a lot of thought that goes into this and construction of us as characters. But what's so important for us, if we think about ourselves as characters, and this goes back to the question of correlation, if the ways in which our actions are interpreted algorithmically depends on people who are quote unquote like us. This means that we're always impacting each other, and we're always impacting what the other person says and is interpreted by. So there's this incredible engagement that we have with each other in terms of producing each other's scripts. And what's always fascinated me about networks are the ways in which they're so profoundly intertwined with different actors and a certain notion of promiscuity, rather than this direct one-to-one action. And to give a concrete example of this, so your network card downloads all network traffic. So you're downloading each other's traffic all the time, and then actively deletes what's not directly addressed to its network card. And you don't see this unless the card is in promiscuous mode. And promiscuous mode is a technical term, and it means that your CPU gets to see what your network card is doing. But if you think about it, this sort of promiscuity, moving back and forth, us reading each other's traffic, et cetera, the fundamental publicness of networks is the network. And the shielding of us into this really bizarre notion of privacy, where privacy means that only corporations know what you're doing and not others, in these fundamentally public networks, is the problem.
Yeah, and promiscuity seems to be exactly one of those words that you are disambiguating, as you mentioned earlier. I thought there was a quite concrete, well, several concrete hopeful moments throughout the book. One of them was, you mentioned this already, the climate models and their use of proxies. And you ask, I think your book outlines a 5-step program of things we can do. And the fourth one is use existing AI systems to diagnose current inequalities and to treat discriminatory predictions as evidence of past discrimination. So harnessing the predictive capacity of models to combat rather than to perpetuate and amplify racism and discrimination. And there are projects like that already underway. Yeah, could you say more about that? That's so great to kind of turn the model and the workflow into a positive.
Yeah, so this really comes from trying to say, you know, the way we treat global climate change models with all their problems is to say they give us the most likely future based on a selected past, not so that we'll accept that future, but so that we'll intervene into it. And so part of it was to say, look, when we look at these discriminatory models, something like Compass, which is a program that's used to understand the risk of recidivism, or Amazon's secret hiring AI, which was shown to discriminate against women, rather than saying, okay, let's fix the model, right? Like when global climate change models show us a 2% increase in mean temperature, we don't seek to fix the model, we seek to fix the world. So to what extent can we say, like, these models, which are problematic, right? And they're problematic for all sorts of reasons, because they take as their basis a deep fake past, right? So you can think of the dirty data that's often fed into risk assessment programs, but they're they're meant to show what is most likely based on this deep fake past. And rather than accepting this quote unquote most likely future, and again, they're only validated if they reproduce the past as well, let's say, well, maybe they actually show us, because they're running properly, what's wrong with the past. So let's look at the factors that cause this kind of discrimination. So for what was so key for me about something like Compass, and Compass is a software program that's used by some US courts to determine the risk of recidivism and therefore also sentencing and parole. And it's been sued for discriminating against racial minorities. ProPublica and Ruha Benjamin and all of the host of people have written on Compass and its problems. What it's important is Compass was actually brought in to take on the question of racism. So this was during the Obama administration, and the idea was that Compass would get rid of individual bias. And racism is an issue of individual bias. So you got rid of individual bias, but what you got accentuated was institutional bias. And because this institutional bias has been accentuated, and we know what causes certain things to predict, to make it certain predictions, right? So age at time of first arrest, which is certainly a proxy for racism, right? It will give us a way to understand and document how discrimination operates. It gives us this mirror, it's condensed in order to understand the operations of discrimination in society today. So again, we don't accept these and we don't automate these, but rather we try to intervene into these futures.
And I'll just add, glancing at the chat, there are many affirmations of precisely that point. I had one last question before I wanted to turn things over to the audience. Another interchapter that resonated with me was about what you call the transgressive hypothesis. And it goes a long way toward explaining these clusters of angrily comfortable or comforted by anger microgroups. And you also call this reverse hegemony at other points throughout the book. And you say there that the constant call to be different has actually fostered populism, paranoia, polarization, and new biometric eugenics. And I was thinking, since it wouldn't be right to engage in a kind of academic exceptionalism, that I wonder to what extent in the humanities we too have been maybe not complicit in, but certainly we have participated in this kind of transgressivism, where in highly routine, predictable ways, we praise artworks for transgressing norms. That seems to be one of the most common moves we make. This has led to people calling for post-criticality by Rita Felsky, for example, that maybe there's other ways we should talk about literary and other artworks. That the only thing we need to say, there should be other things to say about them other than the fact that they transgress X, Y, or Z norms. So I was wondering, if we don't want to accept ourselves, and if I may, I could perhaps implicate your own book, how do we get out of the transgressive paradox? What is the role of critique in all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that it's not something that is, so when I think through the limitations of the transgressive hypothesis and the ways in which the call to transgress has led to these bizarre situations, I'm also look at the ways in which the politics of recognition has been taken over by the radical right. And the ways in which, to the extent that and it's fueled by a certain kind of liberation envy, right? And try to think through the ways in which both technically and culturally discrimination has moved to recognition and what's at stake in those moves. And so for me, part of the question is rethinking through that move towards recognition. Because often the transgression is part of this move towards this other mode of recognition and a certain mode of being. But I do think as well, and this goes to the question of interdisciplinarity that you brought up as well, I think that what's so absolutely key is that we think beyond certain methodologies as the solution. And that what we need to do is actually focus crystal clear on what is the question that we're trying to take on. Is it the question, as your institute takes on, about the future of truth? Is that the question that we have? And if that's the question that we have, then, and we realize the limitations of our own methodologies, part of it is then to work with others who are struggling around questions of the future of truth in order to come up with a different, a way to answer that question. And for me, what's been so key is to argue that one discipline's roadblock is another discipline's starting point. And it could be that certain modes are appropriate within certain places, but the problem is where we stop. And where we stop and where it can go from there might not be within our discipline. And I think that that question of always where we stop is that question of us realizing the limitations of what we do and looking for something moving forward.
That's great. And that has a nice symmetry where we've circled back to some of our earlier conversational points. Okay, so I'm going to turn to the Q&A. I'll relay the questions, although you may see them too. The first one is by Chris Bolster. The question is, your book raises so many important questions about agency. And I think that's so right about how correlation forecloses our future unless we do something different. He continues, it also raises questions about whether a technology like big data inherently exacerbates injustice, or whether it's the unethical humans wielding that technology who are responsible. So do we blame the technology or the bad actors using that technology?
I think what's absolutely key is that we refuse that dichotomy. Because if we look at the default assumptions that are in something like big data, what we see is that it isn't an issue of unethically applying something, but rather part of the issue, or what we need to grapple with, is actually the theory of history that's embedded within these methods. And this is why I think the humanities is absolutely key as well. We can even think of Walter Benjamin's critique of homogeneous empty time. But what's so key to these machine learning algorithms is that, again, not only do they take what's a deep fake past and reproduce it so that if racism is put in, racism will come out, but they're only validated as true if they repeat it. So the way these systems are validated is that you take a piece of data, past data that was either in that set, right? You train the system and then you see whether or not the program can predict this past value that has been put aside, either from the same data set or from out of set, so an entirely different data set. But what's fundamental is that the future is actually the past. The likely future is the repetition of the past, right? This is the most reductive notion of history that's in place. So I think that what's key in terms of thinking this through is not to say it's simply bad actors either way, but it's bad assumptions which get to and which are linked to fundamental political and social problems that we have.
Yeah, and one thinks of, for example, Lisa Gittleman's definition of media, where it's not just human actors, it's not just the techne either, it's the whole, it's everything, all intertwined. There's a couple of questions from Julia Brush. The first is, you write about how big data selectively engages the past to create a certain view of the present and build toward an intended future. How can we broaden our understandings of the past in order to concretely affect the ways our technology envisions the future and to dislodge the discrimination already, quote, in there? Maybe I'll do one at a time, since that itself is quite substantial.
Yeah, no. So one text that I draw a lot of inspiration from is Ariella Azoulai's Potential History. And one thing that she argues is that we need to unlearn a certain notion of progress. And what she's talking about is the archive. And she says, rather than accepting certain notions of progress or accepting certain folk as sources of information, we should treat them as companions. And what does it mean to treat folk who are within archives as companions and as living companions, and the potential that's involved in there? And so one thing that I do in the book is to say, again, if you look at the notion of homophily, it comes from studies of biracial housing projects. And I go back to that initial study, which was unpublished, and some of the responses of residents who were there. And what's so key about this notion of homophily is that it didn't actually describe what happened in the actual housing project. And what it did describe was just the white residents' attitudes towards being in biracial housing projects. They actually excluded all the responses of Black residents. They also excluded the biracial friendships that did exist between Black and white residents because they focused on 3 closest friends. So already within these concepts and within these populations lie all these other stories, lie all these other potentials. And so part of the book says, well, let's revisit them, because, and every time we use these concepts, we reactivate and we touch them. And so part of it is to say, well, what if we thought through different forms of connection? What if, again, as you pointed out, indifference or heterophily, what if those became modes of default connection within networks? What would that look like mathematically? What would that look like socially and culturally? Understanding, of course, that this isn't the solution, but it is a way to enable a richness that moves us away from the debilitating modes of homophily. So part of the book is to say, we don't have to accept these defaults. We don't have to accept these algorithms. We can create different ones. We can work across disciplines to do other things by touching and understanding the richness of the histories and the stories that are there and that get reactivated every time we use these concepts.
And it strikes me that as you were answering that question, that your reading of the Columbia School of Sociology, those archives, is you're demonstrating this kind of Azoulai's potential history in your method in some ways by looking at what was left out, what was in footnotes, and so on and so forth. We have a question from Aaron Maxwell. When you speak about defaults, this might have been from fairly early on, do you mean where we start in terms of algorithm development, for example, applying the standard linear regression, or in terms of developing the algorithms themselves, for example, applying the linear regression in the first place?
I would say both.
Okay, well, that was easy. I hope that answers your question. I'm going to jump to 2 questions which are thematically quite similar. So one is from Heather Love. I don't know if it's the Heather Love. I'm curious to hear more about your experiences with interdisciplinary collaboration. Have you found particular groups of engineers/technologists more or less open to collaboration? And are there helpful strategies you've used or seen others use for overcoming skepticism and resistance to the idea that humanities perspectives are important to discussions of tech? And if I could just add on a similar question from my colleague, Shiri Dori Hakohen, who teaches computer science here. She says, as a CSE, computer science and engineering faculty here at UConn, whose research focuses on polarization, misinformation, and bias, I'm greatly looking forward to reading your book. Reflecting on your insights from this book, what do you see as the meeting points between computing and humanities on the issue of the current epistemological crisis and the breakdown of intersubjectivity? So I know that was a lot, but I think they're pointing to the same thing.
Yeah, so let me answer this through a concrete example. And this is one of the reasons why I moved away from Brown and started the Digital Democracies Institute. So Brown, a new president came in. The idea was we're going to have these faculty initiatives, and then they're going to rise up, and then we're going to choose the best, and this is how we're going to decide the future. But of course, what happened was, we're going to put the faculty together into these groups and therefore build these initiatives from there. And I was put together with a head of computer science, as well as someone in biostats, and said, okay, think through a big data initiative. And we looked at each other and said, well, we're not going to work on this unless we know why we're here. Like, what is a question that we can't answer on our own? Why do we need each other? And the question that emerged from this, and it came from the person who works in biostats and who works on AIDS, said, I can show almost any correlation to exist. I can show almost anything is real, but I don't know what's true. I don't know what matters. And from there, our question was, well, even if something's shown to be true, does it matter? What makes action happen? And so we called it DIAL, like data inference action loop. We weren't selected, but what was so key about that was that we came up with a question that we cared about, that we knew we couldn't answer on our own. And because of this, we were amenable to having our first principles challenged in the nicest possible way, because we cared about this thing. And for all of my interdisciplinary collaborations, people we work with, we start with people who care about the same problem. We care about abusive language, or we care about conflict online, and we know that each discipline hasn't been able to solve it. We are profoundly aware of our own limitations. Therefore, we're coming together because, for instance, they can do large-scale quantitative analysis, but there's that part, of course, that's very sticky, those gray areas, which are actually the problem, that then need qualitative analysis and indeed, or a rethinking of the problem as well. So maybe it's not abusive language, maybe we need to understand the role of conflict. Because if it's a problem that people who talk about racism online are censored by content moderators, that thinking through keywords or certain topics as the way to intervene isn't working. So let's understand the different natures of interchanges. And then the key thing then is to find people who are working on the same question that care about it and that realize the limitations. And then it's just amazing. So we're working with Giulio Dalla Riva, who is a data scientist based in Christchurch, New Zealand, and he's working on anti-fascist data science. There are people from all these disciplines who are working on these concepts and who are reaching out to humanists, right? So the abusive language folk reached out to me and said, look, we want somebody to think this through. And sometimes it's taking that call, being willing to be challenged and to challenge others in the nicest possible way, because what's important is something larger than any given discipline.
Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that one needs what Susan Lee Starr has called boundary objects too, those documents or materials that can flow across disciplines, but are still this object in common. Okay, we have a question from one of our dissertation fellows, Drew Johnson, who is a philosopher. He says, thanks for the discussion. I'm curious to hear more about the distinction raised between correctness or factuality and truth. This is in the context of the verification of climate change models, that example. In particular, I wonder if you think we can further separate truth as such on the one hand, and being verified as true and being taken as true on the other. Do you think there's a value in having a notion of truth that aligns with what is correct? Or perhaps I've misunderstood the distinction.
No, yes, the question isn't that, no, we have to move away from verification altogether, but there is a limitation of making all truth equal verification. Mm-hmm. And that is the moment of debilitation. And this is something clearly that it comes from the political philosophy itself. And so it's not saying we have to move away from verification, but if we say in order for something to be true, we need to verify it, then we are quite frankly screwed. I mean, think through global climate change. It's like, no, we have to wait until the jet stream totally dissipates for us to know that that global climate change is true. Or when there are fundamental concepts such as greenhouse gases, which have been known for centuries, right? So there are fundamental concepts which have been verified, which we don't know the full ramification of. And which are key, but again, this larger notion of truth is something that is struggled over and thought through and can't be reduced to what is reproducible.
Thanks. Here's another question from Julia Brush. And by the way, so Julia's writing about this discussion for a new initiative at Rutgers called Critical AI. You may have heard of it. It's being overseen by Professor Lauren Goodlad. So this is yet another project that's kind of interested in all of these topics. But the question is, if authenticity is vested in perceived transgression, how might ambivalence and heterophily disengage from repeating the script of the transgressive hypothesis to open our understandings of truth? How can we devalue authenticity through our use of technology?
I think that this the question of authenticity is such a hard one because it has always been so contradictory, right? There's, Oscar Wilde's famous "Give a man a mask and he'll tell you the truth." There are competing notions of authenticity that are in place, and authenticating something, and authenticity has everything to do with authority, right? It shares the root of authority, whereas truth shares the root of trust. And so I think that difference between authority and trust is absolutely key to thinking through ways forward. And I think that what's been so key in terms of thinking beyond authenticity as it's currently formulated, again, is to not simply accept authenticity as transparency, but to think through why is this certain kinds of transgressions accepted as authentic, and therefore the basis for certain modes, but to move it always back to that question of authority, to ask us what is the larger rubric of authority that is buttressing these calls towards certain modes of behavior.
Mm-hmm. And we have one last question. Hopefully this hasn't been too long for you. What are your thoughts on the idea of the democratization of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and technology, as making it even easier to deploy algorithms without underlying awareness of how any of the technology works? So I guess harnessing these while dealing with the black boxness of them, I guess.
I think that's what's happening now in science and engineering. I think that a lot of people don't know how these things operate. They're just using it, and it's deliberately meant to be that way. I'm not sure if that's democratizing. I think that we need to think through what we mean by democracy in terms of values, et cetera. I think it's making it more quote unquote accessible or usable. I think that the question of artificial intelligence is certainly huge. And one project that we're working on is trying to think through responsible AI, and not simply in terms of make AI responsible, but what would a relationship of responsibility, right? Where you respond precisely because you have to and your rules fail you, as opposed to you're applying these rules. What would something like that look like, and how could that work with certain notions of engagement.
Mhm. That's great. And I'll add briefly, we had another talk earlier this semester by the PIs of the Black Beyond Data project. And that too was this embrace of data science, but doing something different with it, sort of from within. I found also compelling. Well, Wendy, thank you so much for your time and for this brilliant book, not to mention all of the other brilliant writings of yours. But thank you so much for joining us at the UConn Humanities Institute. And yeah, I hope we can stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for reading the book. It's always a shock to me that people read my books. I'm like, I'm not, you write for it. So, and it's such a pleasure. And thank you for these really wonderful questions.